They didn't just break HOA rules, they buried my creek in concrete. I told them the water had nowhere to go. The HOA laughed and said, "That's not your problem anymore." But here's what they didn't understand. Water always comes back. 3 months later, after one normal rainstorm, their $1 million homes started sinking. Lawns collapsed. Basements flooded. What used to be luxury turned into a swamp overnight. And the craziest part? They emailed residents saying, "Everything is under control." It wasn't. Because when the inspectors showed up, someone had to answer for that concrete. I bought my house because of the creek. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It just flowed quietly behind my property, day and night. Clear water. Small fish. Birds every morning. The creek had been there long before me. Long before the HOA. Long before the gates, the rules, and the warning letters. The realtor called it a natural drainage feature. The county map showed it clearly, marked and protected. To me, it was peace. Behind my house sat a luxury HOA neighborhood. Large homes. Perfect lawns. Stone entrances and strict rules. At first, nobody cared about the creek. It just existed. That changed when new HOA leadership came in. A new president. A new board. A new obsession with clean visuals. They wanted everything controlled. Measured. Straight lines. Water doesn't work like that. The first sign came through an HOA email. One of those long messages filled with polished words. They said the creek caused moisture concerns. They said it was unsightly. They hinted it lowered property values. My stomach tightened as I read it. I replied calmly. I attached county documents. I explained the creek handled stormwater naturally. No response. A week later, I noticed bright orange survey flags. They lined the creek bed behind my fence. I walked over to the HOA office. I asked what was happening. The woman at the desk smiled. That polite smile that doesn't reach the eyes. She said, "Don't worry. We're improving drainage." I asked about permits. She said, "That's HOA business." That answer didn't sit right. I called the county planning office myself. The clerk checked the system. "No permit exists for that location," she said. I took screenshots. Saved emails. Took photos. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I just paid attention. 3 days later, trucks arrived. Large trucks. Concrete trucks. I heard the engine noise before I saw them. Workers stood along the creek. Forms were placed. Hoses were connected. I ran outside. I asked the foreman what he was doing. He said, "Filling the channel." I told him to stop. I said the creek was protected. He shrugged. "Talk to the HOA," he said. Then the concrete started pouring. Gray sludge spilled directly into the creek. The water disappeared under it, like it was being buried alive. I felt sick. I called the HOA president. She answered, annoyed. I told her what was happening. I told her it was illegal. She laughed. She said, "It's approved." I asked, "Approved by who?" She paused, then said, "The HOA doesn't need your permission." That laugh stayed with me. By the end of the week, the creek was gone. Flat. Hard. Silent. Where water once flowed, there was only concrete. The HOA sent out a cheerful email. Drainage issue resolved. They congratulated themselves. Neighbors applauded the clean look. I stood there staring at the concrete, knowing something was very wrong. Water doesn't disappear. It waits. And as I looked at those $1 million homes sitting downhill, one thought stayed in my head. They didn't solve a problem. They created one. And sooner or later, the water was coming back. After the creek was filled, I felt it immediately. The ground near the concrete stayed damp, even on dry days. soft underfoot, uneasy, like it was holding a secret. I emailed the HOA again, calmly, professionally. I explained that the water had nowhere to go. I warned them about flooding, about soil pressure, about basements and foundations. No reply. Instead, a new notice appeared on my door. My grass was half an inch too tall. Apparently, that was a bigger problem than burying a creek. That's when I realized the HOA didn't care about reality. They only cared about control. A few neighbors began noticing small puddles. Nothing major, nothing scary yet. Just little pools forming in yards and driveways. They asked each other questions quietly. Did this happen to you too? Some believed me when I explained what was coming. Some still thought I was overreacting. The HOA continued sending cheerful emails. Everything is fine, they said. Problem resolved. They never consulted engineers. They never studied the soil. They trusted concrete to solve the problem. They ignored warnings from residents. They ignored reality. Summer passed. Dry days gave way to early autumn showers. At first, the rain seemed normal. Nothing extreme. But the ground didn't soak it up like it used to. Water began to spread sideways. Slowly. Quietly. Under lawns. Under patios. Seeping under foundations. I watched it happen. I recorded it. I took photos each day. I emailed neighbors privately. I explained exactly what would happen if the HOA continued ignoring the creek. Still, they didn't act. One afternoon, I saw a neighbor outside, stomping in frustration. Her patio had started sinking slightly. A small crack had appeared near the garage. She looked at me with panic in her eyes. "This is your fault," another neighbor muttered to her. "No, it's the HOA," I said. "They buried the creek without permission." That's when the emails started. Not from the HOA. From anxious residents. Some asking for advice. Some just venting. Some already calling insurance. The HOA, of course, ignored it all. They were busy sending more emails. "Please remain calm," they said. "Everything is under control." I laughed quietly to myself. Under control? The ground was soft. Basements were getting damp. Driveways were sinking. I knew that sooner or later, it wouldn't be a small puddle anymore. The creek wasn't gone. It was waiting. And I kept preparing. Documenting. Saving everything. Because I knew when the water came back, the HOA would have no excuses. They could send all the emails they wanted. They could pat themselves on the back. They could pretend nothing was wrong. But the rain doesn't care about HOA emails. The soil doesn't care about HOA rules. The creek never forgets. And I knew the day it returned, it would make them pay attention. The first big rain came on a Tuesday. Not a storm. Not a hurricane. Just normal, steady rain. I watched it fall from my kitchen window. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The creek was gone. Concrete covered it completely. I thought maybe it was just another quiet day. By evening, I started to notice something. The backyard was wetter than it should have been. Soft patches of mud had appeared near the concrete. Water was seeping sideways. It didn't belong there. I went outside. Neighbors were already gathering in small groups. Some were shouting. Some were pointing. Some just stood, staring in disbelief. The water was rising where the creek had used to flow. It had nowhere to go. The concrete had trapped it. It moved slowly at first. Then faster. In patches. Under patios. Into lawns. Under driveways. By morning, the damage was obvious. Cars were parked in shallow water. Lawns had turned into mud. Steps and walkways had sunk slightly. One neighbor's garage floor was starting to crack. People were panicked. They didn't know what to do. Some tried sandbags. Some called their insurance. Some just stood silently, staring at the spreading water. I tried to warn them. I showed them my photos from before the concrete was poured. I explained how the creek had managed stormwater naturally. I told them what was happening now wasn't a freak accident. It was inevitable. Some neighbors thanked me quietly. Some didn't want to hear it. They were angry, scared, frustrated. They wanted someone to blame. The HOA office was locked. No one answered calls or emails. Panic set in. By afternoon, county trucks were on site. Inspectors walked through the flooded yards. They took photos. They asked questions. One inspector kept repeating the same question: where did the creek go? I showed them my photos and the emails I had saved. The look on their faces changed. They understood immediately. The HOA tried to act. Emails went out to residents. Remain calm, they said. Everything is under control. It wasn't. Basements were wet. Foundations were shifting. Lawns were ruined. Driveways were damaged. People started calling lawyers. Insurance adjusters arrived. News traveled fast through the neighborhood. The concrete that the HOA had poured without permits, without engineers, without warnings, had turned the area into chaos. Neighbors who once smiled politely at each other were now yelling and blaming. The HOA had lost control. The perfect lawns and luxury homes were drowning in their own mismanagement. I stayed quiet. I kept recording. I kept documenting. Because I knew the real reckoning was just beginning. By nightfall, the neighborhood looked like a swamp. Water puddled everywhere. Cars were partially submerged in mud. Patios were collapsing. Lawns were mush. The HOA had tried to solve an aesthetic problem. Instead, they had created a disaster. And I couldn't help but feel vindicated. Not in a cruel way, but in the sense that nature, when ignored, always finds a way to fight back. The day ended with county officials talking seriously to the HOA board. Emails and calls were made. Fines were hinted at. People were already preparing for lawsuits. I went inside my house and looked at the creek area. Concrete everywhere. Yet water was rising. Slowly but surely. The creek hadn't disappeared. It was making its presence felt. I knew this was just the beginning. The HOA had ignored warnings for months. They had ignored reality. Now the consequences were impossible to ignore. The next morning, the chaos hadn't stopped. Water had risen even more. Lawns were soaked. Patios were cracked. Basements were flooded. Cars were stuck in mud. The HOA tried to respond, but it was too late. Emails went out, but no one was listening. Calls went unanswered. The residents were done waiting. By mid-morning, county inspectors arrived. They had clipboards, cameras, and serious expressions. They walked slowly, examining the yards and driveways. The HOA board members followed behind nervously. The inspectors asked one question over and over: who approved the creek being filled? The board shuffled, avoided eye contact. No one answered. I stepped forward with my documentation. Photos, emails, dates. I handed everything over. The lead inspector looked through the files. His expression hardened. This was unpermitted construction, he said. You violated environmental and floodplain regulations. The HOA tried to argue. They claimed they were trying to improve drainage. The inspector shook his head. Concrete cannot replace a natural waterway without proper permits and studies. This is a serious violation. Fines were issued immediately. 6 figures at first. Then more as engineers evaluated the damage. Residents began calling lawyers. Insurance companies refused to pay for some of the flooding, citing negligence. The HOA scrambled. They hired attorneys to defend themselves, but the evidence was overwhelming. Then came the hardest part. The concrete had to be removed. All of it. Heavy machinery arrived. Backhoes. Trucks. The sound of tearing concrete filled the air. Dust and debris coated the neighborhood. Lawns were ripped up. Driveways cracked further from the work. It was chaotic. Residents shouted at the workers. Some blamed the HOA directly. Some just cried silently as their yards were destroyed again, this time in the name of restoration. Engineers supervised the project. They ensured the creek was restored to its natural path. It took weeks, months for the waterway to return fully. Home values had dropped. Some homes suffered permanent foundation damage. Some residents moved away entirely. The HOA president quietly resigned. No announcement. No statement. Board members disappeared. Emails stopped coming. Calls went unanswered. The neighborhood felt different. Tense. Angry. Quiet in some areas. I walked by the restored creek daily. The water flowed gently, just like it had before. Birds returned. Small fish swam again. The HOA tried to rewrite the rules. Now they required permits for any major work. Now they consulted engineers. Now they thought twice before ignoring warnings. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Luxury homes had suffered. Trust had been broken. The sense of control the HOA had clung to was gone. And yet, despite all the chaos, there was a strange sense of justice. Not mine to claim. Not planned. But undeniable. The creek had taught a lesson. Nature doesn't bend to rules. Concrete doesn't win against water. And ignoring warnings has consequences. Residents whispered about what happened for months. Some laughed nervously about the irony. Some still shook their heads. And I walked past the creek every morning, quietly satisfied. Because in the end, ignoring reality never works. And karma, it seems, doesn't need anyone's help. Months passed after the creek was restored. At first, things looked normal. The water flowed gently where it had always flowed. Birds returned. Small fish appeared again. The neighborhood looked quiet, almost peaceful. But the memory of the flood remained. Driveways had cracks. Lawns were still patchy. Some homes had permanent foundation damage. Property values had dropped, and some families had already moved away. The HOA tried to regain control. They held meetings. They rewrote rules. Now, no major changes could happen without permits. Engineers had to be consulted. They tried to look responsible. But no amount of rules could erase the past. The residents who had witnessed it all remembered. They knew the HOA had ignored warnings. They knew they had ignored nature. I still walked past the creek every morning. I watched the water move over rocks. I listened to the birds. I felt peace again. But I also felt something else. A quiet satisfaction. Not from revenge. Not from wanting anyone to suffer. But from seeing justice happen naturally. The HOA had thought they could control everything. Rules, appearances, property values. But they forgot one thing. Nature doesn't follow human rules. Concrete doesn't stop water. And ignoring warnings has consequences. I thought back to that first day the concrete was poured. The laugh of the HOA president. The smug emails. The false sense of control. It had all come crashing down. Not through anger. Not through threats. But through reality. And the lesson extended beyond me or the HOA. It was for everyone who thought they could manipulate or ignore the natural order. Sometimes the universe or just common sense catches up. The neighborhood slowly recovered. People repaired their yards. Homes were stabilized. Some families returned to normal routines. Others moved on, unwilling to deal with the HOA again. But the story didn't fade. Residents still whispered about it when new buyers moved in. They shared the tale of the buried creek and the flood that followed. It became a cautionary tale. A reminder that HOA rules, no matter how strict, can't override nature. And me. I never took credit. I didn't celebrate anyone else's suffering. I simply watched and documented. I stayed calm and let the truth speak for itself. Every morning, I walked by the restored creek. I felt a sense of closure. I remembered the warnings, the threats, and the concrete. I remembered the fear in my neighbor's eyes when the rain came. And I remembered how, eventually, the water found its way. The HOA tried to rebuild trust. Some residents gave them a second chance. Some never would. But I had learned something too. You can fight with words. You can fight with documents. You can fight with patience and preparation. But sometimes, the real power lies in simply letting reality take its course. The creek had done that for me. It had reminded the HOA, and everyone watching, that some things are bigger than rules. Bigger than pride. Bigger than control. And in the end, it was enough. Because while the HOA tried to control the water controlled the story. And justice, as it often does, flowed back in the end.